of a question, any question, think of how it looks to you. Think of how it tastes on your tongue. Did you know questions have tastes? Some of them were born bitter, like a young almond still shedding its screen. Some found themselves curdling into sourness, milk left out with no heed paid to its being. Some mold and wrinkle, sagging under the weight of all the things that they want to mean. The ones I like, they're aged. They have been left in their casks long enough to smell like oak and feel like velvet. There is deliberation to how they exist, a question behind the question itself. Ask yourself a question, any question. What does it taste like? I'm Harnidh Kaur, and I'm going to ask you to think about questions today. Questions is something that we don't think about very often because we've been conditioned since a very, very young age to think of answers. You know, there's efficiency in the concept of answers. You want to figure a question out, you think you know what you want to know, and you want to get out of there as fast as possible. We think the lesser time we spend on a question, the more efficient we are, and that's how we make the world work. Awfully arbitrary, isn't it, though? The idea of time being your measurement of efficiency. What if I told you that the toughest questions on inclusivity, diversity, capacity building, they can all be solved if we slow down. They can all be solved if the questions we ask aren't efficient ones. They're empathetic ones. Sounds slightly fluffy and intangible, which is why I bring you to the crisis of inquiry. I work in the development sector. It's lots of hard work, a few victories, and very often just networking a lot at events you don't pay for. And something I've been struggling with is the crisis of inquiry, which sounds a lot smarter than it is. It's essentially me saying that we have been asking the same questions for so long that we don't actually wonder of their validity. We think we know the answers to the questions we ask, and that makes us arrogant, which is why we don't actually include stakeholders in the answers we build. 2 examples from my very short development career. The first is sanitation. I work in the sanitation sector, and I love the work we do. Sanitation is dignity. In rural India, however, we started building community toilets. We built a lot of them in the past 4 years. I'm sure you read about that specific abhiyan every now and then in the newspapers. We found something peculiar. Women weren't using these community toilets. We built these toilets answering questions of our idea of dignity, community, and safety. But we found out that this is not the answer the women were giving us. When we went and spoke to them, they said, A, these toilets make me feel claustrophobic because they're really small and I'm used to defecating in the open. B, a lot of these community toilets are manned by male custodians. They make them as unsafe as going out to defecate is. And 3, and this broke my heart, it's the only time I get to meet my friends. Going out to defecate in the open at 5 a.m. is the only time I'm not a mother or daughter or a wife. I'm just me. It's my sense of community. Example number 2, I worked with NABARD on a project for 4 years. NABARD is the National Rural Bank of India. They fund the biggest rural projects in India. I worked on a scheme called the Indira Awas Yojana in a small district of Maharashtra called Nandurbar. Nandurbar is one of the poorest districts in the country itself. So, shelter is a basic human right. You want to come home to a safe space. And when I started working on the scheme, I felt very righteous about it. We're trying to solve a big problem. But then we measured data, and we found that women were responding consistently with lesser scores than men were to the idea of a house. Why? Isn't a house safe for a woman? What is happening? Then we stopped looking at data. We went and spoke to women. What we found out was very interesting. Many of the houses didn't have chimneys. Rural women in India, especially those who use wood-fired stoves, spend 8 to 12 hours in the kitchen. These houses essentially became poison tanks for them. They were suffering from lung diseases. They couldn't breathe properly. They said, smell bahut kharab aati hai. What if these policies were made with the stakeholders instead of for them? What if we had asked the questions way before we actually had to go back and rewind this efficiency of throwing out a scheme as soon as we can? What if we exchanged the efficiency of the scheme for empathy? There are 5 ways I think we can do that. When I say we can do that, I mean I often find that we are asking the wrong questions in our personal lives too. We are asking arrogant questions. If you know computer programming, you know something called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Very often we ask questions without context, without deliberation, without patience, without empathy. So we get arbitrary answers, and they don't help us. They just confirm our biases. So what can you do to ask better questions? Context, neutrality, intangibility, reflection. The first thing I'd like to start with, however, is silence. We're terrified of silences, aren't we? Every time we face a silence in a conversation, we fill it up very quickly. We ask more questions, we give our viewpoints. What we don't realize is that silence actually builds a circle of safety. You ask someone a question, you pause a beat, they will open up a little more. You pause a little longer. They will realize maybe what I say is of value to this person, which is why she's not filling the gaps here. Appreciate silence. Context. Think of it, how many times do you ask someone a completely uncontextualized question, wait for an answer, and run away? To give context is to build a rapport. Ask them, I'm asking you this question because ABC has happened, hence XYZ might happen, and I think I value your inputs here. This requires you to actually talk to people instead of just interrogating them. This requires you to pause, slow down, and make some small talk once in a while. This requires you to enjoy the art of conversation and learn how to respect someone else's voice. It's a slow process. It's sometimes a very boring process. But it gives you a variety and wealth of information that you might not have gotten otherwise. Neutrality. We ask leading questions. That's what we've been taught since grade school. You want an answer, hence you ask a question. Think of how you Google. I want to know if smoking is bad for my lungs. I will ask, hey Google, is smoking bad for my lungs? And you will look for a confirmation, saying, you know what, it's not as bad as everyone else says it is, because that's what you want to hear. Think of the questions, and this is a tough topic for me personally, but think of the questions you ask people who come out with stories of their sexual assault. You set them up for failure. You ask them questions like, where were you? Who were you with? What were you wearing? You're waiting for them to break. These are not neutral questions. These are angry questions built to reduce their personhood into a reproduction of violence. You want to know the details because you aren't neutral. You want to know the details because it becomes a voyeuristic exercise for you. A better question to ask would be, do you feel safe with me? Do you think you can let me into your trauma and we can work backwards? This requires you to pause and use your words better. You need to ask yourself, is what I'm saying what I want to hear? If someone asked me this, how would I react and respond? Intangibility. When knowledge becomes currency, it loses empathy. We do not take into account feelings and emotions and the things that words can't always describe but still exist in our peripheries. In development, for example, everybody wants data. Data is the new amazing word. You say data and you get a job immediately because everyone's like, she knows what data is. We need her here. What if I tell you that in the work I do, data is often secondary? What matters more to me are stories, It's the intangible responses that come when I sit and talk to stakeholders. It's the realities that emerge when people let me into their world, because I don't demand of them facts. I demand of them perceptions. Qualitative ability to understand the world is imperative, because as the world changes, you need to be able to keep up. The only way you can do that is to absorb what other people feel. Reflection. When you ask a question, someone gives you an answer, hold it in your hands. Look at it and appreciate it. Turn to them and say, I think you meant this. Am I right? Am I wrong? Is there something more you want to add to what my understanding is? Often you will find that your internal biases have twisted that answer into something completely else. Work with your respondent again and again. Spend 10, 15, 20 minutes with them, because then you will realize that you are figuring out a new world. You are figuring out someone else's perceptions and giving it space to exist in yours. Again, slow, patient, deliberate. I keep coming back to these words because we have forgotten the worth of them. The radical vulnerability of good questions. Good questions are inherently vulnerable. They inherently often set you up for failure because you are admitting to the fact that you can be very wrong. You're admitting to the fact that maybe I don't know enough and I want to know more from you. You're admitting to the fact that there's a vast world out there and I know just a fraction. Take me, guide me into yours. A good question is a safe space. A good question allows for vulnerability, both of yourself and the other person. It's not combative, it's not contrarian. It's kind. Kindness is something that we are fast losing our grip on. How do we bring it back? Through conversation. Conversation and storytelling are incredibly powerful tools of capacity building of our emotional quotients. It takes time, however, and that's what I want of you. Why bother? Why should I care about good questions? I get my work done on time and I get a good appraisal and my boss says, you will get a promotion in 2 years. Why should I bother with better questions? I bother because I care. I bother because I understand that there are trends and contexts and shifts in this world that are going to change into an unrecognizable space in the next 20 years. If I don't keep all my stakeholders moving with me, what is the point of the work I do? If I don't take into account the variables around my world and simply focus on getting my bottom line set tight, what's the point? Radical empathy. Radical empathy is the point, because unless you care with as much emotion as you can spare, we will not be able to save ourselves, ladies and gentlemen. That's a terrifying future right there. There are so many answers. The problem is the question. Have we been asking the right ones? Is there some code we missed before we chased the words that made more sense to us? We gathered all the things we knew how to feel and tried to fit them into a template of desire. Didn't we know better? Did we want to? Did we want to know that we're not meant for softness? Were we prepared for how much those realizations could hurt? We put all our ink into building boundaries. What of the color in them? Did we forget? Or did we choose not to remember how lonely clean lines can be? Are we ready to learn our truths? Is there courage to them or an avoidance of what we've always known? Are these questions better? Will they cushion us when we fall from grace? Did we ever find any? If not, why does it always feel like we are losing it? Is there beauty to be found in abandonment? Isn't there? Someday, I will tell you of how beautiful the sun looks when it finds its way into lost worlds. Hold on to that image of me conjuring a myth just for you. It will be an answer to questions that we were too afraid to give to the world. We can always make them not exist. That is the power we got in exchange for wonderment. Some days, it's almost worth the bargain. Is it though? Is it worth the bargain? The loss of wonderment, the loss of curiosity, the loss of a story around us. Think of all the questions that you asked today. Think of what they meant. What place did they come from? Was it a place of kindness, of curiosity, or malice? Pause again and think of the questions that you've asked yourself recently. How many of them were kind ones? Here's the thing with asking ourselves kind questions. We're very uncomfortable with them. Because when we allow ourselves kindness, the answers that emerge from it are not the ones that we think we want. They often paint us as smaller, weaker people than we hope ourselves to be. So when you go home today, I hope you do this. I hope you ask yourself a kind question that might make you sad, that might make you question all the truths and untruths you've piled upon yourself. Hold that answer in your hand like I asked you to, and give it witness and cognizance. The world is hurting, and we're hurting with it. Asking kind questions is something we can start doing right now to make it hurt a little less. Thank you.